I thought it would be very interesting to meet with Sid Gottlieb. He was enthusiastic about the idea of giving remote viewers LSD as a way of enhancing their psychic abilities. I was opposed to that. Remote viewing requires the person's conscious cooperation, and we explained that to Gottlieb, and he seemed to completely understand. So he led us down into the basement of the Pentagon, and it seemed to us that he was sort of stored in the basement with all of his books. The only really comfortable place we'd ever been in the CIA. The idea, after talking to Gottlieb, that the decision to give us money to go forward probably had already been made.
Reports that the Soviets were using psychics to spy on us prompted us to do the same to them.
There was intelligence, hard intelligence. I mean, intelligence that was like really, really good. Internal program intelligence about what the Soviets were doing in medicine and psychology. That stated that they believed that United States military, United States intelligence officers, and United States scientists would be ripe for recruitment as spies if they were interested in crazy things like psychic research, remote viewing, and parapsychology. And they would tell their government people that were responsible for doing recruiting and so forth, hey, if you want to find somebody in the Washington, D.C. area that might be pretty interesting, find somebody that spends their time doing psychic research.
They must have been following Russ around constantly then.
It's natural for a visually handicapped person like me to be interested in optics, magic, and extrasensory perception. I'm a legally blind motorcycle riding physicist. In 1934, I was born in Chicago. I was a child magician. I used to perform magic tricks at birthday parties and art openings. As a magician, I understand how people can be tricked. That's always made me a better researcher, especially in a field like ESP. I left graduate school at Columbia in 1956, and in 1958, I began working on the earliest development of the laser. And I was looking for a way to get into some kind of psychical research and still support my family.
Russell was enthusiastic, and Hal was more like what you would expect a theoretician to be. But they both came across as, physicists.
I heard that there was going to be a lecture at Stanford University, and there was a young physicist, Hal Puthoff, giving a lecture on psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain, American and Russian ESP. And I then went back and talked to my new friend Hal Puthoff and said, I think I got some dough. Let's talk to your management about creating a program. And he said, that would be very nice. You just have to promise that you'll keep a low profile. So that was in June of 1972. And this led to the beginning of our program at SRI to investigate psychic abilities. I look forward to coming to work. Every day had a new miracle. I feel like the child magician finally got a job doing magic.
As we were doing these experiments, we began to run into flack from the psychologists at SRI. They said, you've got that crazy ESP experiments going on. That's going to ruin our reputation. We're going to lose our fund and get rid of those guys.
Hal had worked for several years in naval intelligence in Washington, and that may have made him a little more secretive indeed.
Yep. I had access to one of the most shielded experiments on the planet. It was a shielded magnetometer that measures weak magnetic fields.
Against his better judgment, Hal snuck his very first subject into a forbidden lab at Stanford. The man claimed to be the greatest psychic in the world, and his name was Ingo Swann. Swann claimed that he could move the needle of an unswayable magnetometer, buried under 30 feet of concrete, with a classified design used to sniff out nuclear explosions.
It even had superconducting shielding. Its claim to fame was that nothing from the outside could affect it.
Not only could Ingo perfectly sketch the design, but the needle moved, and nearly got them kicked out of Stanford for breaking the experiment. And that got the attention of the CIA.
I asked the CIA agents, why are you looking me up? He says, well, we couldn't care less about the fact that he perturbed that magnetometer, but the fact that he could look through superconducting shielding and see what was inside, that is really a concern.
In a way, I can understand other people's response to our work. If someone had come up and told me 4 years ago the kinds of things I'm now telling people, I think I would have been skeptical also.
Well, when I first met Ingo, of course, he was coming out with this claim of, quote, being a psychic, and at that time, before I started seeing results, I was very skeptical, and he was very confident.
The psychic is a kind of remote sensing device, and that I think has a contribution to make to both science and humanity.
To understand Ingo, I think you have to see a creative, highly intelligent, deeply wounded man who found in remote viewing a pathway to the acclaim that he sought.
We might do an experiment that looked like a really good outcome, and he would say, no, this is not so good, and he would come up with some loophole. And so he would say, look, if we take credit for an experiment and then someone can come along later and find some loophole or some false positive, then they'll reject it, and then even when we do good experiments, they'll reject it.
He told me a story. He was a homosexual, which doesn't matter, I mean, who cares, but it mattered to him because he told me a story which I've never forgotten of being beaten up by a bunch of boys who he liked and admired when he was a youth. And I think he wanted to be acknowledged.
I've often recovered many of the thoughts about existence I had as a child. A major one of these was the separation of consciousness from the body, which was very real when I was a child. This kind of thing happens in art. I believe, and always have believed, and I've returned to it many times in my life, that I am not this body in terms of consciousness, and consciousness can go places where the body cannot.
It was very important to him to be validated by SRI. SRI was the first lab of a different order of magnitude from all prior parapsychological research.
What SRI was always upset about is that during our day here, we brought in 1% of the money and 99% of the publicity.
Back in 1972, SRI was primarily a contractor for the government and some industry. With the riots in the late 60s, early 70s, the fact that classified work was going on at Stanford University, they didn't like that.
Up until that time, most parapsychological research was done by small foundations on minuscule budgets operating in a corner of some basement.
At SRI, the level of classification was top secret. It took a long time to get the security clearance.
You can't walk around, you have to be escorted because of the secret projects. Full of high-class scientific equipment, beeping and showing on the cathode ray tubes and all that.
And when Russell and Hal got positioned there, it had a big impact. And on Ingo, it had a particularly big impact because the work that he did at SRI drew a lot of attention.
To be in that kind of laboratory, they must be very important and really have a grasp of the truth. So you guys had a psychological procedure, the in the neighborhood thing, as it were, that was fantastic, and I think that's partially why you got such damn good results.
And all of them succeeded in remote viewing. Drs. Puthoff and Targ do not know how. And so maybe one of the most important things about the work done here is that it has been published in one of the most conservative and prestigious scientific journals in the world. with this note. Few readers will finish without wondering for at least a moment if indeed ESP might be possible after all. What a difference that would make to us all. Jack Perkins, NBC News, Stanford Research Institute, California.
Ingo is really the father of remote viewing in the modern era. Before Ingo, people were describing the picture in the envelope.
Square. Good guess, but wrong.
He said, if I want to see what's in the envelope, I'll open the envelope. I can focus my attention anywhere on the planet, give me something interesting to look at.
And he threatened to quit. And so we asked him, well, you know, what do you mean? What would you like to do? And he says, just send somebody out in the San Francisco Bay Area and I'll describe where they are.
Well, it takes a lot of guts to accept a challenge like this. The psychics involved could sort of get into it at a creative level and discover things very distant from themselves and then go find out if they were really there.
Well, we had, by now, 30 analysts, not scientists, in CIA, and maybe 6 or 7 scientists in CIA talking about these initial dozen or so results of these anecdotal situations.
We began by speaking of some kind of almost a psychic arms race here. Is there any real application to this?
At that time, there were rumors, certainly, that the government was doing something, but nobody actually knew what was going on.
Why are the intelligence communities chasing after this thing called remote viewing? What if there are no secrets? What's really going on here?
They had to put resources on something that sounded crazy. That's what it was. And we would all talk about them and say, well, I know I didn't lie. I know you didn't lie. And we'd get polygraphed once in a while, and it became clear we weren't lying. That wasn't the issue. What's going on?
These people from CIA were very concerned. They had one goal in mind, to prove that it was nonsense. Well, we've looked into your background. You've had these high security clearances. You've been polygraphed. We know we can trust you. The Russians have been spending millions of dollars over a decade at some of their best institutes investigating so-called ESP. No scientists in America even believe there's such a thing as ESP. In fact, it was because the Soviets had a completely materialistic viewpoint. Even in Lenin's writings, he said, since consciousness is an observable, it must be physical, and therefore physical things must have consciousness. And so he thought even atoms had some level of consciousness.
And then the question becomes, how close does it have to be for you to see it? Can you see it in this room, in the next? How about, can you see it on the other side of town? The question began to start formulate about distance.
Maybe, like everything else that we know physically, it's quantum mechanical. That means it's spread out everywhere. It's not in space-time anymore. So exactly the same way that I can focus on my name being spoke, there's something about attention that I can use in order to narrow in and pay attention to something. So if I want to pay attention to what's happening on Pluto 1 million years ago, I should be able to do that. That's kind of what the remote viewers do. I mean, Ingo Swann was looking at Jupiter 9 months before Voyager got there and correctly described rings that no astronomer had ever seen or even suspected. So how did he do that? Well, it suggests that the rings of Jupiter was in his head already. This becomes a very materialistic way of thinking about what's going on, but who cares? I mean, I'm interested in what the truth is.
We don't know how to evaluate this. We don't know if it's a threat or what.
Well, I would say the difference between the American scientific community and the Soviet is that at the highest levels in the Soviet scientific community, psychic research is taken seriously, and there's no doubt about it.
And you claim in this country it is not?
I would say in this country it's not, because people are worried about the so-called giggle potential.
Our normal socialization, being a psychologist now, is that stuff like ESP is nonsense. It can't happen. So if somebody tells you to do it, they're asking something stupid.
And they banged a telephone book size thing down on the table. Paraphysics R&D, Warsaw Pact from the Defense Intelligence Agency. When I thumbed through that and saw all the work that was going